Most of that financing has to come from domestic sources.
David is a senior fellow with the American research group, the Brookings Institution, and he specializes in U.S. China economic relations. He's served more than 20 years with the World Bank, including as country director in China and Mongolia. David co-wrote the book China 2049, Economic Challenges of a Rising Superpower with two economists at Peking University.
We did all the research before this crisis, but I would argue the crisis makes a lot of the analysis more relevant. We were arguing that China doesn't really have enough of a social safety net. It's got problems with the hukou registration system, weaknesses in rural healthcare, for example. If there is more fiscal stimulus, the government can use some of that to be strengthening the safety net, really helping with rural health, for example. So I think the whole social agenda is more important than ever before.
David says the fate of China's economy for the remainder of 2020 will depend largely on how the rest of the world deals with the coronavirus. David, give me a sense, as we look at things, are there certain fiscal policies, efforts that China can be taking right now to get the economy going again?
China's economy is starting to bounce back, but it probably needs a little more fiscal stimulus. The Minister of Finance had a piece, I think it was in People's Daily, arguing for more fiscal action. Some of that just happens naturally because fiscal revenue will be way down this year. So as long as the government keeps doing just normal things, paying teachers, et cetera, that's already some fiscal stimulus. But they're probably going to allow local governments to borrow more for infrastructure. A lot of local governments are handing out consumption coupons. If people actually use those, then the government's going to have to make good on that. So in various ways, we'll see more fiscal stimulus, and that's probably what the Chinese economy needs.
And you and I talked quite a while back about the impact this pandemic has had on small and medium-sized businesses. Is that still where you see really kind of the pressure coming down? It's really tough to recover for these smaller, medium-sized businesses?
People are just not going back to their old way of living, which is natural. They're going to some restaurant meals, but they're nervous. They're not going to as many. Lots of small businesses doing things like hair salons. So I think it's going to take a while to get people back to those activities. And the evidence is that small firms in China are really hurting pretty seriously.
China vowed to end poverty, defined as making less than $416 a year by 2020. But the pandemic has slowed those efforts, greatly affecting poor migrant workers and rural industries. The head of China's poverty alleviation efforts says public welfare jobs and government purchases of crops could help ease the economic blow. I remember back to President Xi's New Year's message, and of course, one of the big themes this year, ending poverty as we know it in China. Now you've got more people out of work, probably more people impoverished in a sense. What does it do to that campaign?
Yeah, the poverty rate is almost certainly going to go up, at least for a while in the middle of the year. As things recover, they may be able to bring that down. China started out its reform with just about the whole rural population poor. And I remember traveling through remote parts of Sichuan and Yunnan in 1986 by local bus. So I have a very visceral sense of the extent of poverty throughout a lot of rural China. They've done a tremendous job reducing poverty, mostly by getting economic growth. If you start with everybody poor, then growth is the only real solution. But now you're down to a pretty small fraction of the population. If you use that World Bank extreme poverty line, you're in the single digits of Chinese people who are poor, and then you need a different approach. You've got people who are disabled, people in extraordinarily remote locations not connected to markets. You really need the social safety net rather than just broad growth. So I think this pandemic makes that whole social agenda of strengthening the safety net more important than ever before.
January seems like a world ago, where a month seems like a lifetime with this pandemic. But remembering back to January here in Washington, D.C., Vice Premier Liu He here, the fanfare about finally an end to this disagreement about trade, a trade agreement, China agreeing to buy all these products. Clearly, a lot of people saying that's not going to happen. So talk to us about that.
Right. So before the pandemic hit, I did say that the targets were somewhat unrealistic and that they involved the U.S. exporting about 40% more this year to China and then 40% additional increase in 2021. In reality, in the first quarter, the U.S. exported 25% less compared to that 2017 benchmark. So, we're off to a terrible start in terms of that deal. And then you look at the particulars, the U.S. is supposed to export $50 billion of energy, but the U.S. energy industry is shutting down because, the deal said all of this would take place based on market conditions. Price of oil is down around $25 a barrel. U.S. can't produce at that price, so it's shutting down. So our firms are they don't want to sell to China at $25 a barrel. Services, we're supposed to export more services. What do we export? That's Chinese students going to American universities and Chinese tourists coming to Las Vegas and other places. All of that stopped. How can the U.S. possibly export more services if we're not letting Chinese people into the United States? So I just think you look at the details, and a lot of it is clearly impossible. But to put a little bit of a silver lining on it, the ag exports, they're not up very much yet, but I think China does need food imports. So there is some real potential there. And you had a phone call recently between Liu He and Steve Mnuchin and Lighthizer. They've agreed they're going to continue to try to implement the deal. And I think the agricultural part does have some potential because China definitely needs food and the United States has still got a pretty big surplus in agriculture. So there might be a little bit of silver lining there. But the overall deal seems very unlikely we'll get close to these targets.
The Belt and Road Initiative is China's global development strategy to build infrastructure and trade networks connecting Asia with Africa, Europe, Latin America, and beyond, sometimes referred to as the New Silk Road. Since its launch in 2013, China has issued $400 billion worth of foreign contracted projects like roads, railways, and power stations. Clearly, when you think of China, you think of the Belt and Road Initiative. What does it do to the Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, it's definitely affecting the Belt and Road Initiative. Probably that was all happening at too large a scale. China was lending a large amount of money. It's hard to get a precise estimate, but I saw a good estimate recently that China's lent about $350 billion to developing countries for infrastructure. And a lot of that is needed, but that's a large amount of money to lend into what are often quite risky environments. And now the virus is going to cause tremendous recessions throughout the developing world. So there will be many countries that need to reschedule their loans. China seems open to that, which is encouraging. But probably when we come out of this, some of those projects will end up getting scrapped. And I predict Belt and Road will continue, but on a smaller scale than what had been envisaged.
The Great Recession of 2008 cost $10 trillion in lost growth globally. An estimated 205 million people around the world were jobless by the end of 2009. The recession lasted 18 months, but its effects were still felt years later. The World Trade Organization has predicted that the downturn and job losses from the coronavirus will be worse.
We've really never seen anything like this before, so it is hard to make predictions. It was amazing how quickly China bounced back from the 2008 crisis. I remember a dinner with Chinese and foreign friends in Beijing in the worst of that 2008-2009 crisis, where we were all making projections for 2009. And in the end, China grew faster than any prediction from any of the experts around our table, even though we had a wide range of predictions. I think people were, ready to continue their lives back then, but they lacked money. They were thrown out of work. And when the government came in with the big stimulus, then people got back to work and they got back to their lives. As you say, this is really different. I think we're going to see long-lasting effects. I think Chinese people, they already were saving a lot, but they're going to be saving more. People are going to be more cautious. So this is really going to change the way the whole world economy is operating. It'll probably take a few years to settle into a new normal.
So if you look at China, it's struggling, the U.S. struggling, everybody seems to be struggling. So give me your sense of the global economy and which countries are likely to rebound quicker, and how does all of this interconnected quality that we see out there impact one another?
You know, it's hard to be optimistic right now. I think we have to be realistic. This is a tremendous global challenge, and people's safety is definitely the most important thing. I don't think there's really a distinction between people's safety and recovery of the economy. Having said that, I think China is recovering okay, and as we discussed, with some additional fiscal impetus, China as a big economy can probably do pretty well. And the best cases then are going to be the more medium-sized economies that are closely tied to China. So South Korea has handled the virus very well. And as China recovers, South Korea will probably recover quite well. The United States, we're not really doing what we need to do in terms of testing and contact tracing. So as I said, I worry the US gets a small W, not too much of a rebound, and then we head back into recession. So I don't think we can count on the US to be the engine of global growth. Europe has done some encouraging things just recently, but I do think China, among the big economies, China is probably the best hope for a decent recovery, but let's not get too excited about that because it's a comparison among economies that have been severely hobbled.
So it's not likely to be a V-shaped recovery then. How would you describe it?
I think a W is more likely. What I've been saying is that China will get a capital W and the United States will get a small W. And the W means, of course, there'll be some rebound after the worst of the lockdown. We're going to see that. Most American states are starting to reopen. So, of course, there'll be some rebound from the worst of the recession. But probably there'll be some resurgence of the disease, plus these changes in behavior we were just talking about. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we got a second downturn, a second recession. And in China, you might get a pretty quick first rebound, but then a second recession. And then finally, we have to hope we come out of this. So I don't know how deep that second one is before we get the upswing that makes the W.
In China's effort to be a leader in the global innovation economy, President Xi Jinping has encouraged greater science and technology research, especially when it comes to artificial intelligence. The pandemic has already opened up opportunities for digital firms. For example, Chinese tech giants Tencent and Alipay have developed apps that show a user's health status and exposure to people who have been potentially infected. And Chinese surveillance companies Hikvision, Dahua, and others are selling thermal imaging systems to detect people with fevers. So let's finish with a question about the book, because one of the fascinating aspects of it is you're talking about China's transformation into this innovation-driven economy. And of course, we've heard Premier Li Keqiang talk about that a lot. I mean, it's been front and center with the Chinese leadership for at least the last few years. What are some of the challenges there, and what are some of the encouraging signs you see there? And we'll end with that.
Right. So on the plus side, China is spending about 3% of GDP on research and development now. That's similar to what other advanced economies do. And since China is the second biggest economy in the world, it means it's the second biggest in terms of research expenditure. It's turning out literally millions of students per year who have been in the so-called STEM fields of science, technology, engineering, and math. So it's creating a foundation. I would say it needs to strengthen its intellectual property rights protection. We've seen some moves in those directions. People are surprised when they hear that 95% of patents in China go to the private sector. I mean, that's where most innovation occurs. But a lot of that research money in China goes to state enterprises. They haven't really produced much track record, and just globally, we don't see a lot of innovation in state enterprises. They tend to be slow old dinosaurs, rather than nimble young creatures. So, we need to see, I think, more resources going to the private sector in China. And then you've got the overall resources, you've got the human capital. If you had some policies that was, stimulating the R&D in the private sector and then protecting the intellectual property rights once things are invented, I would expect China would be a leading innovative country. And I would just add that that's a good thing for the world. If China invents a vaccine against this coronavirus, that would be great. If the United States or Switzerland, whoever, I mean, as a human being, if there's a reliable vaccine, you really don't care who invented it. And they're probably not even going to get that much financial benefit because there'll be tremendous pressure to make it essentially freely available as it should be. So it's more of a honorary award to develop the vaccine rather than a great financial reward. But I think that it's a nice concrete example of what we might see is some real progress against not just COVID-19, but other medical problems. That would be a tremendous example of technological innovation.
We'll leave it with the silver lining. We're looking for those these days. David Dollar, always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much.
All right, great. Thanks a lot.